Okay, so in this video we're going to take a look at how to compare the contents of two arrays. So in order to do this, we want to create two different arrays. We'll go ahead and show this conceptually. So we've got our two arrays. And so they're going to be two different properties of these two arrays that I want to compare. The first is going to be checking the size of them. So I want to make sure that the length field of both of these arrays is equal. And if that's true, then I also want to go ahead and check the individual items of both of these arrays to make sure that the items match. So to give you a general idea about this, say we go ahead and create our two arrays. And then for each one of these, I want to add some items to it. So maybe we're going to go with this 25, this 33, and this 15. So I want to check each of those individual items to make sure that they all match up. So the idea here is to make sure that these 15s at position 2 match up, these 33s at position 1 match up, and these 25s at position 0 match up. Okay. So the idea here is that we will first check the lengths. If those lengths are equal to each other, then we'll also go ahead and check the items, and we're going to do that by essentially going through another loop where we step through both of these arrays, and we are constantly checking the items at equivalent positions in them. So now we'll go ahead and try to implement this in code to see exactly what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new file here, and for this one, I'm going to call this array compare. So you can go ahead and make a new Java file or a new project in your IDE, and give it the same name. So I'll have array compare.java. And so then I'll go ahead and make the header, make our main method. So I'll have our public static void main. And so then inside of here, we'll go ahead and make the two arrays. So we're going to have two int arrays. I'll call the first one nums. Say this is equal to the 25, 33, and 15. And then we'll have a second int array. We'll call this nums2. And this one will also do 25, 33, and 15. Okay. In addition to these two arrays, I'm also going to go ahead and create a flag. So we're going to have a boolean right here. And the reason that I want to have this boolean is because of the fact that since I'm doing two different checks, one for the lengths and then one for the individual items, I essentially want to be able to use this flag to constantly keep track of whether or not the contents up to a certain point, or whatever our current point happens to be, that they're equal to each other. As soon as the contents are shown to not match up in some way, as soon as we see that they're not equal, then we want to go ahead and change that flag to false so we can immediately stop doing any comparisons. So we're going to have a boolean. I'm going to call this is equal, and I want this to initially be true, and then we're going to change it to false if anything doesn't match up. Okay. So we'll go ahead and create the first check, which is to check the lengths. So we're going to do that first, since checking the lengths just requires a single comparison, and it's very short and easy. And then if that's true, then we can go ahead and start comparing the individual items, since the process of checking all of the items of the array, this requires multiple comparisons and tends to be a bit more time consuming. So we want to do that after checking the lengths. So the way I'm going to do this is I essentially want to use this if statement to check if the lengths are not equal to each other, because if they're not equal to each other, then I'm going to change is equal to false. So we're going to do nums.length. If that's not equal to nums2.length, then we're going to take this is equal and set that to false. Okay. And then if this ends up working, then we can go ahead and start checking the individual items. But because of the fact that I'm using this boolean as part of my the process of checking these, I can't use a for loop like I've been doing for all of our other array processing up to this point. Instead, I'm going to have to use a while loop. So we're going to say while, we want to use this is equal. And then the other thing we also want to check for is whenever we reach the end of the arrays, we want to stop once we get to the end, once we found that the entire contents of both of these arrays are equal to each other. So we're going to use an and right here. And then the next thing I'm going to need is that index that we've been using. So we need some kind of int variable here. but because I'm doing this with a while loop, I can't declare and initialize that just right here in this expression. So instead I'm going to go ahead and add an additional variable here. So we're going to have an int index, and I'm going to initialize this to 0 so that it matches up with what we've done up to this point where our arrays are starting from 0. And then we'll go ahead and take that index, and we want to continuously check it for as long as it's less than the length of these arrays. And if this ends up being, if this condition ends up being false, meaning that the arrays both have the same length, it doesn't really matter which one I use right here, but I'm just going to go ahead and use the first one. So we'll do nums.length. Okay. And then inside of the body of this while loop, what I'm going to go ahead and do is for each step through this while loop, for each iteration, we're just going to check the value at index for each one of these two arrays, and if those end up being not equal to each other, then we can change this is equal flag to false. So we'll go ahead and say if the value at position index in nums, if that's not equal to the value at that same position in nums2, then we're just going to go ahead and say is equal to false. Okay. And then, of course, to make sure that we eventually do reach the end of the array, we need to make sure that we're incrementing this value of index. So we'll do index ++ right here at the end. Okay. And once we've gone through all of this, by the time we get through this if statement and this while loop, at the very end, is equal will either be true if we went through everything and we found that the contents are equivalent to each other, or at some point it will become false if we find that anything doesn't match up. And so at the very end here, I want to go ahead and include two print statements to just go ahead and show whether or not the arrays are equal to each other or not. So we're going to say if is equal. If that value is true, then we'll have a print statement. So we'll go ahead and say the arrays are equal. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and do a separate print statement, and we'll say the arrays are not equal. Okay. So we'll go ahead and compile and run this. Right now, because they have the same length and the same items inside of them, we should get the arrays are equal. So we'll go ahead and compile this. And then we'll run it. Okay, so we see at the very end we get the arrays are equal. All right. So then if we change anything about this, say maybe we first want to change the length. So if we add an additional item to this, say something like 8, go ahead and compile this and run it, and we'll see that the arrays are not equal. Additionally, if we instead keep the number of items the same, but we just change one of these values so that they don't match up anymore, then again, when we compile this and run it, we'll see that the arrays are not equal. And then one additional thing to point out is that we are checking these so that they are at the same position. So we're checking to make sure that there's a 25 at position 0, a 33 at position 1, and a 15 at position 2. If we rearrange the order of these, then again, this is going to show that they don't match up because we're doing these comparisons right here. So we'll see that 25, so that's good. But when we get to this point, we're going to see that 33, which is the value that we find at position 1 of nums, that doesn't match up with this 15, which we find at position 1 of nums2. So if we try this, this also results in the arrays not being equal to each other. Okay. Okay, so this is going to wrap up everything for being able to compare two arrays. Going into the next video, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about other kinds of arrays that we can have, besides just these int arrays that we've been using for everything up to this point.